Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm John Breeden, and I will be moderating what I know will be a lively and interesting discussion about election security and specifically the voter experience. This is obviously an extremely timely topic. As of today, there are just 75 days left until the presidential election, with many states set to begin early voting or absentee and mail-in voting well before that. In addition to what promises to be a very passionate presidential election, many states are also picking their representatives for Congress and the Senate, as well as numerous state and local offices. And in addition to all of that, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, which has many voters rightly concerned for their personal safety, as well as the safety of election workers to consider. To compensate, many states are modifying the way that people are voting, both in person and remotely. So keeping our elections secure and providing a unified, trusted voter experience for everyone might be challenging this time around. So it's a heavy topic, but thankfully we have 5 extremely talented experts to break it all down for us today. So let me welcome each one of them, and then we can get started. First off, I wanted to welcome Dan Persico. He is the Chief Information Officer for the Virginia Department of Elections. Welcome to the webinar today, Daniel.
Thank you, John.
Excellent. And we also want to welcome the Senior Advisor to the Executive Director of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, Maurice Turner. Maurice, it's an honor to have you joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. David Devine is an Election Integrity Fellow for the Alliance for Securing Democracy and an expert in this field. David, thank you so much for being here today.
John, thank you for having me.
Excellent. And Steve Feldman is an intelligence analyst working with the FBI and the Foreign Influence Task Force. Steve, it really is an honor to have you joining us today.
Thank you, John.
Mark Lovelace is a senior security researcher with GitLab. Mark, thank you for joining us today to talk about this extremely important topic.
Glad to be here.
Great. Well, we have some questions about protecting the voter experience and some of the potential threats and pitfalls of the coming election. But first, I wanted our audience to learn a little bit more about each of our guests here today, their experiences, and the organizations that they represent. Daniel, let's start with you. You have worked in information technology for over 20 years, including specializations in network engineering and information security. Before that, you chose to serve your country for 15 years as an Air Force officer. So what got you interested in election security?
Well, John, it was actually by chance that I got into elections. I was working actually as an IT director in a healthcare organization prior to this. Somebody had forwarded me a job announcement, and I had spent majority of my career in public service. And so when I saw this, I was like, well, that'd be interesting. And so so I applied and went through the process and, found myself running the technology and security for Virginia. Hit the ground running, if you will. And it was definitely a change of pace. And I'm very glad I'm part of this.
Excellent. Well, now you're the Chief Information Officer for the Virginia Department of Elections, where you are responsible for ensuring the safety of the election in that state. And Virginia is not a tiny state. People sometimes forget that. But as of 2019, there were 8.5 million residents in the Commonwealth, spread out over 85 million square miles. They live in 95 counties and 38 independent cities. Can you tell us a little bit about how elections run in Virginia and how you plan to help provide a good voter experience across the state this year?
Absolutely, John. And as you mentioned, it is no small undertaking in the Commonwealth of Virginia. There's quite a bit going on. The way Virginia works with regard to elections is we're considered what they call a top-down state with regard to elections, meaning each locality is responsible for putting on their own elections, locality, which can include counties or cities. And in those localities, there's electoral board and then a general registrar. And those individuals are all responsible to put on those elections at the locality level. The agency I work for at the state level is responsible for providing overall governance as well as the technology solutions, such as the Central Voter Registration Database. And in that approach, all the general registrars rely on those systems and kind of the governance that we set forth and carry on from the Virginia General Assembly as the law dictates from that. So that's sort of high level of how that works. One of the things that we're focused on to provide a good voter experience in Virginia is honestly uniformity. We want to make sure that everything that we do is uniform across all those localities, all 133 localities in the Commonwealth, whether it be, the Central Voter Registration database itself and how it's used by each of the general registrars, whether it's, to add registrations, remove voters that no longer, are eligible to vote in Virginia, things of that nature. And also we have constituent services such as a citizen portal, which you can go online, register to vote, as well as request absentee ballots and things of that nature, change your address. And we want to make sure that it's consistent and easy to use. That's probably, in a nutshell, one of the biggest strategic goals that I have, specifically around technology for my team.
Makes sense. Well, I'm sure we'll be able to talk to you more about that as we continue. Let's move on to Maurice. Maurice, you've been working with elections for a very long time. You've had jobs in local elections in both California and Virginia, holding progressively responsible positions from clerk to lead inspector overseeing multiple precincts, all of which provided you with firsthand insight into the balloting process and technology like the transition from paper to electronic ballots, all of which makes you a perfect subject matter expert for the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. How did you become involved in election security, and what do you think is the most interesting aspects of that and your job?
Well, I was first introduced to this idea that our elections were under attack, like many people were, about 3 years ago. So we were hearing news of election interference coming from Russia and potentially other foreign entities. And so during that time, I was actually a technology fellow in the U.S. Senate on the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. And so the committee has oversight over DHS, which, as we know now, is in charge of making sure that our infrastructure is secure. And so I took advantage of that opportunity and went to the DEF CON security conference. And I saw the voting machine hacking village, and I knew this is where I could play a part. It's this interesting confluence of public administration, security, elections, and just making sure that people can access our democracy. The fundamental way that Americans access our democracy is through the ballot box. And so if we can't protect that, then we really do have a challenging time keeping our democracy together. And so those are the things that keep me interested and keep me motivated to help make sure that now as a member of the Election Assistance Commission, that the EAC can really help, drive voters to the ballot box because they are confident that their elections are going to be run at the state and local level by folks ensuring that the security, accuracy, and accessibility of that election experience is really the priority. And so, the EAC has been around for almost 20 years now as a part of being established with the Help America Vote Act. And so that really guides our efforts to make sure that, as we're developing the voluntary voting system guidelines, as we're being this national clearinghouse of information for election administration officials, that we can put those best practices out there and help make sure that every step along the way, the voter is confident in the process that their vote is actually translated during the election.
Excellent. Thank you, Maurice, for that great overview and for a look at what the Election Assistance Commission does. David, you are an Election Integrity Fellow for the Alliance for Securing Democracy, a bipartisan transatlantic initiative that develops comprehensive strategies for governments to defend against foreign state actors and their efforts to undermine democracy. Kind of some of the things that Maurice was talking about just now. And it's a very heavy goal that you and your alliance have set out for yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about how the alliance works and what you do to help secure elections?
John, I'd be happy to. I think, when the Alliance for Securing Democracy came to be in 2017, right, democracies around the world were and are to some extent under assault, right? Authoritarian regimes such as Russia, China, and Iran using and continue to use a suite of cheap but effective asymmetric tools to try and undermine, right, democratic states and institutions, including our elections. And in some cases, right, the vulnerabilities within our democracies enabled and in some cases facilitated foreign interference, right? We at ASD began to notice that some democracies found themselves ill-prepared to defend and deter such threats, and we recognized that meeting this national security challenge meant that there needed to be bipartisan, right, transatlantic efforts, right, in the United States as well as elsewhere to respond to this challenge. And so the Alliance for Securing Democracy is a bipartisan transatlantic initiative. It's housed within the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And we develop comprehensive strategies to deter, defend against, and raise the costs on authoritarian efforts to undermine and interfere in democratic institutions. And we'll bring on experts from disinformation, malign finance, emerging technologies, election integrity, which is what I work on, economic coercion, and cybersecurity, as well as other regional experts to collaborate, right, across traditional stovepipes and develop cross-cutting frameworks to try and mitigate, right, some of these threats that emanate from foreign adversaries. And, we've been doing this work, right, since 2017. We are continuing to ramp up, obviously, with of course, the 2020 election and many other things in mind.
Excellent. Well, thank you, David, for that great overview. Steve, working as an intelligence analyst for the FBI must be a fascinating job. And I know that you are specifically working on an election task force right now. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do there at the Bureau and what the FBI is doing specifically to help secure the pending election?
Absolutely, John. Thank you for inviting the FBI to speak on such an important topic. I started with the FBI 4 years ago, working counterintelligence matters, and then I moved over to provide counterintelligence support to the Foreign Influence Task Force, which in the alphabet soup of government we call the FITF. The FITF is structured around this task force model, which means that we have members from each one of the FBI's 4 operational divisions, which include cyber, criminal, counterterrorism, and of course counterintelligence, which is a word that I never thought I'd mention in a public forum. As we were just saying, right, so the FITF was set up in 2017 by Director Wray after we noticed that foreign adversaries were ramping up their foreign influence operations. So I'm going to use the word foreign influence quite a bit, so it's going to be important for us to define it going forward. So at the FBI, when we say foreign influence, what we're specifically talking about foreign influence of a malign nature, and even more specifically, the FBI's mission to combat the operations being undertaken by foreign actors to malignly influence the United States. So these actions include operations by foreign powers to influence U.S. policy, distort political sentiment and public discourse, or undermine confidence in democratic processes and values. So when we sum it up in an acronym, we say that the FBI is concerned with actions that meet one of the SUCC criteria. That is, they are subversive, undeclared, criminal, or coercive activities by foreign actors or their proxies. Now, all these activities take place where traditional counterintelligence operations occur, which is away from the public eye until arrests and prosecutions are made. So in many ways, we believe that our indictments should and do speak for themselves. But in combating foreign influence, there's great power in bringing awareness of what foreign governments do and are doing against the American people and bringing that to light. So the FITF also took over a program we call Protected Voices, which the tagline is, "Your voice matters, so protect it," which this started off as a way of briefing political campaigns about basic practices such as cyber hygiene, but we expanded that out to include briefing the American public on things like foreign influence. You can actually see under my bio, under resources, you'll see the Foreign Influence Task Force and the Protected Voices Initiative as well. And you can also just go to any search engine, type in Protected Voices in the FBI, and it's the first thing that pops up. And so while we can talk more about FITF and Protected Voices, I also wanted to say that foreign influence isn't the only area that the FBI engages in to secure elections. So more classically, more long-term, our Criminal Investigative Division runs election crimes coordinators, which include special agents and intelligence analysts, out of each of the FBI's 56 field offices, and host command posts during the election with federal, state, and local representatives. The important distinction here to make is that the Department of Homeland Security, so DHS, protects the physical election infrastructure, while from the criminal lens, we at the FBI look at things like illegal campaign activities, which include foreign contributions, voter suppression, and voter fraud. And then for more information, your audience can also go to the next bullet point, go to a search engine, and type in election crimes and security in the FBI, and that's also the first thing to pop up.
Excellent. Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. Mark, you have a fascinating bio. In addition to being a senior security researcher for GitLab, you also talk about your hobbies as an explorer and a hacker. You have spoken quite a few security conventions like Black Hat. What piqued your interest in election security specifically?
Well, election security specifically is probably a combination of two different things. Number one, I have a background exploring security, particularly in areas where things are supposed to operate one way, and then you're able to influence or change them to make them work another way. And so the more important that system is, the more interesting it is. And so that certainly has piqued my interest. The other part of it is how some elements of it are fairly solvable in life. I mean, like where I work at GitLab, we write software to help people develop software. And it does something called basically DevSecOps, which is normally DevOps, which is development of software. But putting the sec in there for security means that you're looking at the whole spectrum of security throughout the entire process of development, not just at the end, which unfortunately is how most of the rest of the world, particularly with software related to elections, seems to fall into that category. And having worked there and specifically we use our own software to write our own software, if that makes sense. And so you begin to learn those processes, and considering that we ourselves, we get code suggestions and changes from the public because we're an extremely, extremely open company. I can't stress that enough. So we're used to this very, very interesting environment where you could potentially receive code in from sources that you don't necessarily know who they are, but you need to make sure that they're safe and stuff before they're added into that whole repository. That's the kind of model that I think could apply quite well in general to election security, specifically, obviously apply more towards software. Although from a project management perspective, the principles are still the same, just kind of an oversight of that. And so between those two, it really has piqued my interest, partially just from an intellectual exercise, but also there are some practical things I think that can be done to really help lock down and secure things.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure we'll get into some of those practical suggestions in just a bit. So thank you all for the great overviews and insights about your jobs and your position with regards to election security. We are certainly going to talk about things like protecting the secrecy of the ballot, the integrity of the election. But I wanted to start with a couple general questions about election security this year to set the tone so that we kind of all know what we're dealing with. Maurice, can we start with you on this one? The U.S. Election Commission has been helping secure elections since its creation in 2002, and you've personally been involved in this area since 2004. Based on everything that you've seen over the years leading up to today, what does the threat landscape for the upcoming general election look like compared with previous years?
Well, the past 3 years have been heavily focused on cybersecurity. And not that the other aspects of elections are a lower priority, it's just that everyone's eyes were open in 2016 to the level and type of risk that we face on the cybersecurity front. So a lot of resources and partnerships have been established and put into trying to make sure that from a cybersecurity point of view, we're not as vulnerable. And I think officials across the country have done a fantastic job getting the support they need and making sure that they're putting that education into practice by becoming more resilient in terms of cybersecurity. This year changed everything again. COVID-19 pandemic was unexpected, not only how quickly it took over all aspects of our life, but also how deeply it's changed some of the procedures that are necessary for people to feel comfortable voting. And so now we have these significant changes, and people are more interested in voting by mail, and also people are more interested in getting the facts about just how they can change the way they vote. whether it be modifications to procedures or eligibility. So from that point of view, misinformation has again become a priority that the agency is focused on making sure that election officials know how to get the information about their elections out to the voters so that the voters can be well informed and make a decision on how they want to vote, not only in the primaries, but also come November.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. Daniel, I'm sure this must be an issue that probably keeps you awake most nights, at least for the next 70 days or so. What kinds of threats are you most concerned about regarding the general election in Virginia? And did you have to deal with any unexpected challenges during the recent primary elections that your state held in March and June?
So, John, obviously the biggest concerns that I have are that of most election officials right now, which is, foreign or domestic threat actors trying to negatively impact the election process. I'm less concerned personally with, at least with Virginia, the ability for these threat actors to necessarily penetrate and affect the outcome of a vote. But I am very concerned with misinformation and disinformation, which were highlighted previously as a pretty significant threat. And combating that is one of the areas that not only myself but my leadership team are focused in on holistically. And one of the ways that we are going to try to deal with those type of things is to establish great partnerships, not only with other state, local, and federal entities, but also organizations like social media platforms and things like that. Secondary concerns are around how to put on an election in a global pandemic. Obviously, that's new to all of us, and we want to make sure that we give everyone the opportunity to cast their vote safe and secure. And I believe, reaching back to we had to move our primary from March to May. We had one primary in May, and then we had another one in June. In those two, there wasn't a lot of issues, or we weren't caught off guard from a security perspective, but we did have a lot of issues that we had to contend with regard to the global pandemic, such as getting our hands on personal protective equipment, PPE, and other things of that nature when everybody is also trying to do it. And, first responders take precedent. So those are some of the issues that we face, and we have generally overcome a lot of those. So I don't foresee any of those things becoming an issue moving forward into the November election.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. David, based on your experience studying foreign government interference in elections and governments in general, are you concerned that there will be actions taken in 2020 against the election?
John, I appreciate that question. I think in short, I'm certainly concerned. I think to a point that, Maurice and Dan both made, I think that election officials have continued to take a number of steps to secure their election infrastructure, and a recent report put out by the Center for Election Innovation and Research, I think, highlights that, particularly with regards to voter registration databases, right? That said, there continues to be room for improvement, right? There are still a couple of states that don't use multi-factor authentication to restrict access to their voter registration databases. There could still be some improvement from some places on improving monitoring and auditing practices, right? And there are still some states that don't monitor or audit their voter registration database data input forms to protect against malicious input. And that's really important because obviously in 2016, right, in a small number of cases, we saw Russia being able to infiltrate or breach voter registration databases. But I think it is important to note that broadly speaking, progress has been made. More broadly than that, I think about foreign interference, and I think about it in, 5 categories that, our intelligence and law enforcement community has spoken about, right? Cyber operations targeting election infrastructure, cyber operations targeting political parties, campaigns, and public officials, covert influence operations to assist or harm political organizations or campaigns or public officials, covert influence operations to influence public opinion and sow division, as well as efforts to influence policymakers and the public, right? So those are sort of 5 places where, I continue to have some concern, and I think folks need to continue to be vigilant. Obviously, the 5th volume that came out from the Senate Intelligence Committee just recently right, spoke to some of those things in really clear ways. And so, I think the bottom line on this is that I think we've made an awful lot of progress since 2016 to now, but we need to continue to be vigilant, and where we can continue to take steps to further, right, secure our infrastructure or mitigate mis and disinformation, we need to continue to do so.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Steve, would you agree that this is going to be a challenging year in terms of election security? And how concerned are you and the FBI that some entity might try and disrupt the election in one way or the other?
Yeah, so John, this is going to be a challenging year for election security, and we are concerned that someone or some entity may try to disrupt the election. But that said, I want to put this in perspective for you and everyone listening. This threat is not a new threat. Foreign actors have been attempting to interfere with U.S. elections and U.S. policy for a very long time. And not just the United States, the Russian government and the Soviets before them have been disrupting elections around the world, and our foreign partners have been very helpful to us in understanding the threat and what we can do about it. I also want to point out to everyone listening that hyping the threat without proposing solutions is playing into the hands of our adversaries. The Russian government wants you to be upset. They want you to doubt, and they want you to question the integrity of U.S. elections. And more fundamentally, they want you to question the very idea of democracy. If Russia can convince you and me and all of your listeners that the U.S. democracy is the moral equivalent of the Russian government, they've won and democracy loses. So let me tell your audience a few different things. One, the U.S. government is doing our part to protect U.S. democracy from these malign foreign influence actors. And two, you're all part of the solution. Here's what you can do. First and foremost, decide to be part of the solution. Secondly, educate yourself. One of the ways of doing that is by looking at the Protected Voices website. One particular part of that site that I wanted to highlight to everyone is media or news literacy. For the people who read the news or go on social media, this is particularly important. For the sake of time, I'll leave this there, but a search for media or news literacy will direct you to some really great resources.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Steve. I feel empowered. Mark, I know you've attended a lot of the hacker conventions. I know the hacker election village was mentioned at one. So I'm sure you've heard a lot about election security and seen some of the threats firsthand at Black Hat and other conventions. Based on everything that you've seen and everything that you've heard, because I know you're tapped into that kind of area, how high do you think the threat will be to the election this year?
I think it's very high. I think that it can take many different types of forms. Both Stephen and Daniel alluded to this, is that part of this has to do with just perception of an attack. There could very well be somewhat disruptive campaigns where you have someone says, well, I've broken into this system and here's a screenshot that they've taken from a manual or they've created themselves on a computer or whatever it is that they've done, and says, look, I've broken into so-and-so state's voter tally system and here's the database. Just saying that creates doubt, and that's an important part that to echo what Stephen was saying, is that this perception of doubt into our processes is going to create its own level of chaos, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the attack will have to be successful. I really do think with the changes that have kind of gone in over the past few years, that there's going to be some improvements, particularly improvements that have occurred within the past couple of years. But we're going to see some stuff happen, I think, and I think that there is going to just end up being as divisive and argumentative and full of the chaos we've already come to see with the way things are going on right now in the world.
Okay, well, that was very sobering, but thank you for that. So I wanted to talk about the misinformation campaigns and this as a disruption campaign, because not only have all of you mentioned that already, but in the previous webinars in this series, many of the speakers talked about that. In fact, some of the ones from the local boards have mentioned that that's the most thing that they're worried about. So I wanted to talk to you all about that because hackers don't necessarily need to hack a voting machine if they can spread information about the process, or, as some of you have mentioned, get people to believe that their vote doesn't count. David, from what I saw in 2016, it seemed almost like misinformation campaigns were kind of the weapon of choice to try to skew the election, and they were just kind of getting started then. So based on advancements in this disruptive technology, are we going to see more of that this year? And is it possible to counter those kinds of threats?
John, I think that's an excellent question. I certainly think that we're going to see more of both mis and disinformation. And I think we've seen it, right, play out in the 2020 election cycle. In fact, both Russia and Iran have tried to use the possible delay of election results due in part to COVID-19 as prima facie evidence of electoral corruption. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth, right? And so I think it's really important that between now and election day, and I think some of this has been going on already, but it needs to continue to do so, that we see, right, proactive sharing of accurate election information. That doesn't mean that we can't or we shouldn't be responding to mis and disinformation as it occurs, right? I think that there's obviously a place for doing that, but I think it's really important that accurate, timely information is being shared. You know, it's a point that a number of the panelists have raised before. In a big election, and I've been a former local and state election official prior to this role, you would be dealing with a certain amount of mis and disinformation anyway. The pandemic has the ability to exacerbate that. We've seen large segments of the populace express uncertainty about some best practices in terms of how to deal with the pandemic. And in some cases, even our experts haven't been necessarily sure what to do as the pandemic has evolved. And so, you know, I think what's going to be really important is that people plan, right, for election day. They come up with a plan as to how they're going to vote, verify their registration, and execute that plan. I think it's also important that voters are patient, right? We are very likely to see changes to our election processes between now and November, in part because of maybe things like lawsuits, but also because we could see evolutions of the pandemic. And of course, when there's uncertainty, that's the perfect opportunity for threats like mis and disinformation to thrive. And so I think it's really important that particularly folks who are accurate and trusted sources of information are getting out information in a proactive manner about the elections so that people are unlikely to be swayed by mis and disinformation. One wonderful example of this, and there are many, of course, is the Trusted Info 2020 campaign that was begun last year by the National Association of Secretaries of State, right? And talks about leaning on state and local election officials as valuable sources of election information so that folks are aware of what they need to do, where they need to do it, and when they need to do it.
Wow, thank you, David. That's great. A lot to think about there. Mark, I know you've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you specifically: are there any disruption campaigns going on right now that maybe we're not looking at, not studying, or not being aware of, but maybe we probably should be?
That's kind of a loaded question. Mainly because in many cases, I mean, there's been disruption campaigns for all kinds of different things. If any of them would be applied to the voting process, I wouldn't be surprised at all. I mean, we're not talking just about the whole, just like a lot of the things that's happening in, like say, you know, where they've been doing the hacking of voter machines at say DEF CON, for example. Yes, that is a threat. There's threats to other components of this. I mean, where do these machines, once they've gathered all their data, how are they uploaded? You know, what's the process of uploading that data to whoever's going to be doing the tabulation? And what machines are they running on? How are they doing this? Is this being handled SneakerNet? Are they putting things on flash drives and carrying it to someone? Are they doing this over the internet? I mean, it depends, you know, all on that, how they're going to be doing this. And when you throw in the potential disruption that we may be facing with just, forget about the whole thing that's going on with the U.S. Postal Service. It's kind of a hot topic right now. Just the fact that a lot of people are going to be voting from home via mail, what kind of stress is that going to put on the system? Are there things that could be done from a disruption standpoint to affect those? I've mentioned this in a couple of other places where I've just said what happens if there's a attack against the power grid during this process? What could happen to that? That could be a major influence, or even something as simple as a natural disaster, a major hurricane, something like that. I mean, November probably not, but you still get my meaning. Something that could happen that just could create additional stress on the system. So there's a lot of conventional danger, and I think that probably one of the cures for some of that is just making sure. I don't know if we have time to do this before this election, but certainly moving forward, we need to establish processes in place where we can actually trust the entire process, make that whole process as open as possible so that we all can examine it and we can all trust it.
Makes sense. Daniel, how critical do you think it will be to protect against misinformation campaigns harming the voter experience in Virginia? And what steps can election boards, like the one that you work with, take to counter this increasingly deployed threat?
Yeah, so first off, I want to ditto everybody else's comments on this already. It is really important to ensure that as a constituent, we're looking for the source of truth. There's a lot of data out there, right? And whether that data is accurate or not, we have to also question whether that is the case or not. From Virginia's perspective, we're working very hard to create partnerships, to identify things and have feedback, not just from the localities, but also from the citizens. When they see something and they question something, how do we report that? Who do we report it to? How do we get that corrected? That is one of our biggest things, boots on the ground, if you will, activities that we're trying to do to make sure that the right information is there. We're also working on the data on our website, making sure that that is clear and concise and that we direct people to that. So if they have questions or they wonder where their polling place is or things like that, that's all out there and available through an actual government, state government trusted platform, and that nobody, even if somebody else says, well, this is not your polling location, they know to question it and then to look for the actual source. And then if we find out that somebody's telling somebody to go elsewhere, that we essentially work with wherever that source came from to eliminate that data. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Maurice, sort of the same question for you. I know there are thousands of voting jurisdictions across the country that the Election Assistance Commission is trying to help. What are some best practices that you can recommend to them when trying to build resilience and trust into their election systems, and especially to counter misinformation campaigns that might be well-financed and highly targeted at state and local election jurisdictions?
Well, the EAC does three main things with state and local officials. We try to offer cooperation, education, and information. So connecting those officials with other federal partners, providing best practices as a form of helping to educate not only the officials, but also the voters, and then information. So we actually collect data about how voters participate across the country. And so from that standpoint, the state and local officials can tap EAC to help them answer questions. And the question that I like to start off with from an election official point of view is, imagine a voter comes to you and asks the question, hey, I saw this news story on TV about blank. How do I know that my vote counts? So being able to answer that relatively simple question can lead to sort of a complex conversation. So we have to remember, being practitioners, being deeply involved in elections for however many years we are, doesn't mean that all voters know all the steps that go on. So this is really an opportunity to help tell the story about what happens to a ballot when a voter receives it and when they use that pen or that ballot marking device to complete their ballot, and then it goes through the tabulation process and then it's double checked. So I think that that's really the best way to help instill voter confidence, is just to talk about what the process is, because that builds up that level of trust that the system is in fact resilient because there are checks and balances that are already built in, and there is more opportunity to help bolster those systems to make them even more resilient. And I think that's what it comes down to when we're trying to counter misinformation campaigns. We want the voters to know that there are safeguards in place. And so when they know that the safeguards are in place, they feel more comfortable and more confident in the process. And more importantly, they can share that story about the safeguards that are in place within our electoral processes, rather than sharing what is perhaps misinformation, talking about some of the weaknesses or just untruths and speculation about what our system is missing.
Makes sense. Thank you, Maurice, for that. Steve, is the FBI ready to combat disruption campaigns, and do you consider them as much a danger as more traditional election security issues, hacking voting booths and things like that?
Yeah, so John, the FBI is already hard at work combating disruption campaigns. The important thing to remember is that our adversaries start their influence campaigns a year or so out from elections. We've actually already been in the thick of things for a while, and while the American people are thinking about something else, behind the scenes we've had our election strategy in place. So to give you some perspective, we went on a roadshow to field offices last year to brief them on the strategy for mitigating election threats to the 2020 elections. To your second point, though, I don't want to say that any threat to the election is more or less dangerous than any other. The FBI has dedicated special agents and analysts working all of the threats related to the elections. I will say a topic like foreign influence is where the public can get most actively involved, and the Protective Voices website is a good place to start getting the resources needed to be good citizens. That said, though, issues like illegal campaign activities, foreign contribution, voter suppression, and voter fraud are all serious crimes, and anyone seeing them should contact their local FBI field office. The Election Crimes website I mentioned before is a great resource, and people can also remember 3 words: place, time, and manner. So any attempt to tell someone else a wrong place, a wrong time, or a wrong way of voting is a crime.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Thank you. In terms of the actual voter experience, which was the topic for today that we wanted to basically talk about, nothing defines it quite like the Help America Vote Act, which has requirements for error correction in voting, accessibility for those with disabilities, and alternative language accessibility. Maurice, your agency was actually created because of that act. In your work with state and local election boards, do you think that they're doing a good job meeting both the accessibility and error correcting requirements of the law?
Accessibility has greatly improved since the passage of HAVA in 2002. We have to remember that every voter has the absolute right to have an independent, private, and secure voting experience. Now, sometimes those different elements can come into conflict, and so the EAC is committed to studying and responding to the needs of voters with disabilities to ensure that things like accessibility technology and election technology can work in concert, and that we're not sacrificing one over the other, but we're trying to help manufacturers and voters and election officials come to a consensus about how to bring these together to maximize the security and accessibility of the voting experience for as many voters as possible.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Daniel, of course, I know that Virginia strives to meet all of the requirements of the Help America Vote Act, but because of the pandemic this year, do you think that some of the requirements like accessibility will be challenging for some of your municipalities? I know some of your counties and cities are smaller than others and probably less well funded or technologically advanced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the pandemic itself has definitely presented challenges. But with regards to accessibility, we continue to strive to make sure that we work with our vendors and work within the EAC guidelines to ensure that we provide, at least from a certification perspective in Virginia, we provide localities with the ability to choose and purchase equipment that will best serve the needs of the voters. We always have in the back of our mind, and we're always looking at different ways that we can accommodate that through different negotiations with vendors and things of that, and making sure that it aligns with our security standards, things of that nature.
Makes sense. David, I know we talked a little bit before the show started about the voters themselves. Are there things that individual voters can do to help make sure that they themselves have a good voter experience? I know Steve was kind of talking about empowering yourself and learning about disruption campaigns and making sure that you're an educated voter that kind of knew all the facts. But are there things that you would recommend to voters to kind of protect or safeguard their own voter experience?
John, that's an excellent question. And yeah, just to hop off on Steve's point, yeah, I think there are a number of brass tacks things that voters can do, right? If voters who are who are listening in haven't already done so, right, you should either be registering to vote, right, or making sure that you're registered to vote ASAP. You know, one of the things that came out of the Senate Intelligence Committee report in 2016 was that Russia had the ability to, in one state, to potentially modify voter registration entries. Now, there's no evidence that that happened, and there are a number of safeguards in place that state and local election officials have. But if you check your voter registration record and you see that there's a discrepancy, either because of a technical glitch, maybe a user error by an election official or something more nefarious, you can obviously make that correction in advance, which is helpful, right? I think the next step after that, right, is figuring out how you're going to go about voting. You know, I think we've seen an awful lot of even some questions here as well as questions elsewhere about, you know, should I go vote by mail, right? Should I go vote early in person? Can I use a drop box? I think it's really important to be reaching out to your local and or state election officials to understand and know what your options are so that you can make a plan as to how you're going to vote. And I think that that's really important. And so if that means you want to be able, for example, to vote by mail, in many places that means you're going to have to submit an application to do so, right? And depending on where you are, that could be an application you fill out in person. It could be something you send through the mail. You may be able to use an online portal. So there are a whole host of questions that one can tackle as they get closer and closer to election day, from registering to vote to requesting an absentee ballot to figuring out what your options are so that you can correctly and early enough cast a ballot. And of course, if you're so interested, you can also be reaching out in advance so that you can be able to figure out, Maurice's point earlier on, how to ensure, in fact, that your vote, right, is cast and counted properly. Because again, we've seen an increasing number of states and localities go to paper-based voting systems. And the benefit of that, of course, is that voters can verify those ballots. The benefit of that is that such ballots can be audited, right, on the back end following an election. And we see an increasing number of states and localities that are doing robust post-election audits, which have the ability to validate the results and ensure that the winner is the winner and the loser is the loser.
Makes sense. All right. Well, thank you. The great ways to protect yourself. Mark, I had a slightly different question for you based on some of the things that you were talking about. I know we'd mentioned the pandemic and cybersecurity and moving to mail-in voting. I was just curious from your perspective, with your background, I think you would be great to be able to talk to. Do you think that the pandemic itself will complicate the cybersecurity picture this year, you know, making it easier for hackers to slip in and do something or for people to disrupt it? Or do you think there may be some advantages because of moving to alternate voting, like mail-in voting ballots in some states, for example?
I think there are some advantages to mail-in ballots. For one thing, I know there are several states that already do it, that allow it, and it's just something that is allowed. I know that there's a lot more states that are trying to adopt it or are adopting it this year. I think one of the big advantages to moving to mail-in ballots is you might actually have more participation, and particularly from people that, you know, for whatever reason, maybe they can't take off work. Maybe their job doesn't let them take off work. Maybe they can't afford the time off because, you know, they need every single hour that they're working, and so I think it might help in those cases. It's already complicating things just for the reasons that you said. I mean, just the fact that we have that there, the pandemic is there. It's already complicating things to a certain degree because it's already causes stresses. And like as several people have mentioned here today, it requires people now at this point to start making a plan. Like, can I vote early? Can I actually do mail-in? I personally am probably not going to be able to do in my state. I'm going to have to probably go in early, and I'm hoping that they will have more days of early voting, so that I can go sometime before election day and do it that way. But yeah, the other, probably the biggest advantage is that it's going to hopefully set enough of a precedent as to saying, well, this is how bad it can get, and we need to plan accordingly. So for the next major election, we actually have better processes in place to be able to handle any and all situations.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, Mark, and I hope you get to vote safely.
Me too.
So absolutely, both our time together here today and the time before the election are rapidly running out. So I wanted to ask each one of our amazing guests a final question for the day. David, you've been working in election security for many years and are working to help ensure the integrity of the general election in 2020. Based on everything you've learned and everything we've talked about today, do you think we can have a fair election this year with results that end up being trusted and verifiable?
John, I think that's an excellent question. It's a $20,000 question. I think the answer is yes. I think we can. Certainly, it would be more helpful if Congress was more forthcoming in providing more money, right, to help states and local election officials, right? We know that part of the reason we're having the conversation and some of the security concerns stem from the fact that some local election officials don't either have sufficient resources or IT options or IT folks to be able to help them with certain security issues. But, as a former state and local election official who's been following these issues closely, I think that we've come a long way since 2016 and are continuing to take steps, right, to secure our elections. And so, whether it's offering and having more paper-based voting systems, whether it's putting in place stronger chain of custody protocols, right, so that we make sure that, in fact, the way people vote, right, those votes are carried out by bipartisan teams in a secure manner, transparent manner to the election offices so that they can be tabulated is really important, or whether or not the fact that election officials are increasingly doing post-election audits to validate the results and help ensure that any attempts at interference, right, with pieces of our infrastructure are more likely to be caught. All of those things are positives. And so, I am hopeful and do believe that we can run a fair and secure election, and I'm certainly hopeful that'll be the case.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I hope your prediction is true. Daniel, from everything that you've told us today, it seems like Virginia and its different counties and independent cities are in a pretty good position going into the 2020 general election. If there are any state and local officials, either from your state or others that are listening in, who still need to shore things up, are there any relatively easy or quick steps that you could recommend they might want to undertake as something that can make a difference for them as election day approaches?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing that I've learned since becoming the CIO for Elect in Virginia is again, it goes back to partnerships. I would not be very successful in my role if I did not team up with partners like CISA, the EAC, even some of the independent ones that are funded through DHS, like Elections Infrastructure, ISAC, organizations like that. With regard to election security, that's been critical in helping not only me, but my entire agency, as well as some of the localities in Virginia, achieve a better place, a better posture. We all have a lot of challenges. There's been a lot of changes that we've seen in Virginia. It's the first year we're ever doing early voting or no excuse absentee voting. And so bottom line is partnerships are essential in making sure that we all have what we need and we can ensure voter confidence as well as ensure the process flows as smoothly as possible.
Excellent. Well, Daniel, I wish you and everybody in Virginia best of luck with that. I hope the election day goes very smoothly for you and your constituents. Mark, you kind of already mentioned. Oh, absolutely. Mark, you kind of already mentioned this a little bit, but you're our resident hacker for this event. So, I know we're kind of long on our time here, but I am curious to know what you think. In your opinion, do you think, I'm asking you to read the tea leaves here. Do you think attackers will be able to disrupt the election in a couple of months? Or do you think that all the things that we have in place will be able to prevent that from happening?
I do think we'll be able to prevent most things from happening. it depends on what you mean by disrupt the election, quite frankly, as to whether attackers would be able to do that. If they're directly attacking people that are responsible for running the machines and doing the tabulations, I think we stand a better chance than before, because certainly I'm hoping that more people are doing simple things like patching their systems and using two-factor authentication and just basics are being done. I think there's a lot more of that we're seeing now. So I do think we'll be able to prevent a lot more. It's just the problem is that I think we're going to see a lot more attacks in general than we probably have seen. And I'm guessing Steve might have a few things to say about that.
I was just about to ask him. Steve, are you confident that the FBI has enough resources to help every state and local government that needs assistance in protecting the election? And can they still reach out to the FBI if they need more help in the final 11th hour, if you will?
Yeah, definitely. So state and local governments should absolutely be in contact with their FBI field office, and specifically their election crimes coordinator. And as Daniel mentioned, right, these relationships and partnerships are so important, because it is important to remember that the FBI isn't the only government agency operating in the election space. So while we may be at the place where the state and local governments feel the most comfortable starting, we work very closely with our partners at DHS, who have the election infrastructure security mandate, and with our partners in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to ensure proper coordination. And as we talked about, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency under DHS, they do offer free services that state and local governments can take advantage of.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Steve. And Maurice, it looks like you get the last word today. Given that the election is right around the corner, what advice can you recommend to state and local election boards that may still need some help shoring up their elections and providing for a safe and accessible voter experience?
Election officials are responding to the challenges of 2020 by making sure that voters have a number of options to cast their ballots safely and securely. That means that officials are essentially running multiple elections at once. They're preparing for both increases in in-person turnout as well as increases in turnout by mail. This is a tremendous challenge. I don't know how they do it, but I'm very thankful for all of our state and local officials who are working so hard to get the job done. They need help. So they come to the EAC for guidance on things like security, safety, accessibility, and accountability. But those election officials also need help from poll workers. So I would encourage officials and really anyone who is willing and thinks that they're able to be a poll worker to visit helpamericavote.gov to find out more information on becoming a poll worker. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Well, that'll do it for us today. I wanted to thank personally all of our speakers today. You've given me a lot to think about and raised my confidence in the election and what is being done in the back end to protect us. And I hope the audience feels the same way. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.